To mount the dropper, you need a bolt and a nut. A suitable washer is also recommended, but not mandatory. The dropper has been designed to repurpose the 1/4-inch 20 by 3.5-inch bolt and one of the nuts from the case feeder that comes with the press. If you're using the standard 1/4-inch bolt, start by inserting the nut in the top hole of the base of the dropper. If you're using an M6 nut, insert it in the bottom hole. Please note that the nut is inserted at an angle. Next, insert the bolt, and optionally a washer, through the bottom bushing. Insert the bottom bushing from the bottom of the case feed hole port. Make sure that this opening faces towards the case feeding ramp. Lower the base and nut onto the bolt, and get the thread started by rotating the base. After a few turns, the base can be lowered into the port. Make sure the round cutout in the back fits to the mounting hole of the die. While holding the base in place, tighten the bolt by hand, making sure that the base ends up with this opening towards the case feeding ramp. The bolt must only be tightened so that the base is held firmly in place. Over-tightening could damage the part. Next, thread the thinnest nut onto the base. If you're starting with a pistol caliber, thread it all the way down. For rifle calibers, go halfway. Then add the dropper assembly, and finally the thicker nut. The nuts should only be tightened by hand. The height of the dropper depends on what type of cartridge you are feeding. Most pistol cases are dropped below the dropper. Most bottleneck rifle cartridges are dropped with the case neck still inside the dropper. The goal is to drop the cases as close to the top of stroke as possible. If a case is dropped below the lever, before reaching the top of stroke, it must not be allowed to reach the lever again, or re-enter the dropper hole. If the case shifts, it could impact the lever and damage the dropper assembly. However, if a case is dropped while the top of the case is still above the lever, it will simply slide back up the feeding hole. It is also important not to short-stroke the press, as this might cause a case to impact the dropper body. The case dropper is mainly adjustable in two ways. The dropper itself moves up and down to fit the case length. The ratchet-style trigger bar is then adjusted to trigger the dropping. If you are using the trigger bar with a spring-loaded lock, you can adjust it down in click increments by pushing it. To adjust it up, press and hold the trigger lock, and move the trigger bar. The teeth on the trigger bar are 4 mm apart, but the two sides are offset by 2 mm. If you can't quite find the sweet spot with one side, the other side will provide a step in between. If you're not using the spring-loaded lock, you may instead use a short M6 screw to lock the trigger bar into the exact spot you like. This is meant as an alternative to the spring-loaded lock, and might not be viable in the long run. 3D printed threads do not always come out perfect, and there might not be enough material to reliably use a metal screw indefinitely. If you want to use this method, insert the trigger bar from the bottom with one of the smooth surfaces facing the screw. Only tighten the screw enough to hold the trigger bar in place. Over-tightening may damage the trigger bar and the threads. To avoid binding and wear, always make sure that the trigger is oriented so that the rounded area of the trigger rides on the case slider. Now we will look at the recommended procedure for adjusting the dropper to a new cartridge. How to adjust to a pistol case. Start by retracting the trigger bar to the top position to disable it. Raise the ram and place a pistol case on the case feeder ramp. Adjust the height of the dropper to where you want it to drop. For most pistol cases, this will be when the case is just below the dropper lever. Put the case inside the dropper. Center it over the case feeder ramp, and loosely tighten the nuts. Adjust the trigger down until the drop is activated. Place one or more cases inside the dropper and test your setting. Adjust if necessary. Remember that the opposite side of the trigger bar offers a half-step adjustment. Before finally tightening the nuts, please note that the dropper can also be adjusted slightly in or out to compensate for different case diameters. How to adjust to a bottleneck rifle case. Start by retracting the trigger bar to the top position to disable it. Raise the ram, and place a bottleneck case on the case feeder ramp, with the dropper behind it. Adjust the height of the dropper to where you want it to drop. For most rifle cases, this will be with the neck inside the dropper. Put the case inside the dropper, and center it over the case feeder ramp. To minimize the required stick-out of the trigger, the razor for the case slider should be used when reloading longer cases. When using the riser, always make sure that the trigger does not come in contact with anything on top of the dropper. Adjust the trigger down until the drop is activated. Lower the ram, and make sure that the case clears the dropper. If the case is stuck in the dropper when you lower the ram, you can activate the drop earlier by adjusting the trigger. Alternatively, you can raise the height of the dropper, and then readjust the trigger. And always make sure that the combination of dropper height, case slider height and trigger stick out is within a safe range. Operating the press with wrong settings can damage the dropper or the press. There are currently two adapters available for the dropper. The tube holder adapter accepts 4 of Lee's case feeder tubes, with an outer diameter of roughly 0.565 inch or 14.35 mm. The case feeder adapter accepts a Lee case feeder tube on the inside, or a standard drop tube from the popular home-free universal reloading system on the outside. To install the tube holder, first place the indexer in its slot on the dropper. The tube holder comes with one screw that goes in its center hole. Thread the screw into the center hole in the dropper body until the slack is gone. Apart from the indexer, there should be little to no resistance when rotating. The case feeder adapter is attached by 3 screws. It comes with wood screws, but you can also use M4 machine screws. There are also cutaways on the bottom to accept M4 nuts if the screws can't bite into the plastic. If you're filling a tall case tube or a long feed tube from an electric case feeder, this might force a case to protrude, and even be dropped, without intent. This is most likely to happen with larger rifle cases. To prevent this, you can disable the trigger, and raise the ram. If a case is dropped, it will be caught by the feed ramp if the dropper was already adjusted for this case.